unelected, largely unaccountable billionaires are getting special access to this incoming Trump administration and Senate Republicans and others. At the same time that the Republican Party actually just did something politically that was a big deal. They built and grew their support among working class, sometimes called blue collar Americans. And so this is an important story where politically the Republicans had good news. You could see that in the exit polls. We covered this economy election from election night on. But that political step was, by all accounts, Republican voters, observers, supposed to be matched by some sort of delivery mechanism for those working class Americans. So keep that in mind as you look at scenes like this, as the world's richest man, Elon Musk, makes this sort of big kind of hero's welcome entrance into the buildings and around the Capitol and the Senate because he's holding private meetings with top Republicans. You can also see he's joined by a very successful, very wealthy businessman, Vivek Ramaswamy. MAGA figures that are heading up a group outside the government that's literally named after a commercial product that one of them's involved in that they say will help improve the government. So the self-dealing, in a sense, has already begun when it comes to branding. And they want to do enormous cuts, as much as hundreds or even $500 billion out of the annual budget if they could get Congress to agree. It's unclear how they would do this and what services or programs might be slashed for Americans in states red, blue, and in between, and certainly in those working class areas where Republicans did improve their vote totals. We also don't know what rules they intend to test when you see headlines like this. And the DOGE plan that you see up top, that is a DOGE plan to reform government. That is one of Elon Musk's business ventures that he makes money off of. It has to do with cryptocurrency, but it's no different than saying, business-wise, the Tesla plan or the Coca-Cola plan. So, again, buyer beware when the people telling you they're going to save you money are already using their new program to promote themselves and their own business interests. Now, the rules are designed in most government areas to avoid partisan purges of career workers when new administrations come in. So if one of the things they want to do is not only cut programs like health care or the safety net or money that might go to you or your parents, but they also want to try to cut down on the federal workforce, on public servants, well, it's not even clear how far they can get with that, again, unless they were able to change some pretty major laws. So it's more than just annual budgeting. As for Elon Musk, I'll tell you one thing. He may not have been in politics long enough to know that this is not helpful to the Senate Republicans he's meeting with. He has admitted all of this would cause pain.
We have to reduce spending to live within our means. That necessarily involves some temporary hardship, but it will ensure long-term prosperity.
Elon Musk there, Trump ally, is referring to decreasing government spending on certain things. He has not said it should reduce spending on the government money that goes to him, which we'll get to. He's not going to feel hardship. And when you look at all of this, there is a major conflict of interest here. In other words, you can try to track this story on one of two levels. The first level is how much should the government have cut out? And it's perfectly valid and often the position of more conservative politicians, Republicans, to cut government spending in some ways. You've heard that before. The second level is, who's doing this? And do you think it's going to be good for you as a taxpayer to have a Coca-Cola or Tesla or DOGE plan that's already self-dealing, overseen by someone who has all these conflicts of interest? Elon Musk controls companies that have ongoing contracts and taken a lot of money from 12 different federal agencies. Again, he has not publicly said that the reduction in spending should include reducing any of those agencies' money that goes to his companies, which enrich him, have helped, among other things, make him the richest man in the world. 11 agencies have oversight investigations into Musk's business. Now, I'm not saying that's a terrible thing. They are supposed to do that. There are regulators that deal with many different businesses. But now he is trying to kind of come through with a back door and oversee their funding, right? So that's a conflict. Musk is also talking to Republican leaders who have power potentially as well in a different mechanism over those investigations. Now, there is not current reporting, in all fairness, that these conflicts, that's a situation, have turned into some sort of active malfeasance or scandal. And after all, we're very new here. This DOGE thing, which you can think of as a Coca-Cola or Tesla plan, this thing's brand new. The meetings today are private and brand new. But the conflicts are already a problem. There's a company as well, Trump.org. You might recall, whatever you think about The whole year we lived through, there was a fair process with a jury and a system that found that was a company doing fraud. Donald Trump also pocketed millions in foreign payments from the first term. Again, a conflict of interest, something no other president in either party had done, because no other president insisted on trying to operate active businesses that took money from anywhere, let alone foreign governments. And then there's the second term issues. The New York Times has been reporting that basically, based on what happened in the first term, which had a lot of ethics problems and scandals, a lot of agency heads that Trump picked were pushed out and ultimately basically held to account in ways that he was not and lost their jobs. We did a big report on that heading into the election. And now they're planning fewer ways to have guardrails, which you can interpret as concern about the past scandals, that they just don't want to deal with the headache, or that they are basically saying it's open season for all kinds of people to use the government for personal gain. Again, that doesn't help workers. That doesn't deal with the price election, the inflation election we just went through. MAGA allies, meanwhile, big picture, separate from those Trump ethics issues, say they want to cut the safety net. And then they want to also shift resources by cutting the safety net, but then taking money from those programs and effectively over time shifting them to the wealthiest Americans through more millionaire and billionaire tax cuts. And so some of the final polls before the election did show, as I mentioned, Donald Trump ultimately edging out Harris by 7 points on handling the economy and, again, all the prices concerns. But these are the plans. We're past what I call that good news for Republicans in the campaign, and we're getting towards the governing. And Trump's bringing in these billionaires also directly in the administration. Musk wants to have it both ways. He wants to oversee government spending while still getting a lot of government spending, but not taking a kind of job, because he knows, he's a sharp, shrewd operator, that if he did what some of these folks are doing going into the second term, they would then be subject to even more rules and oversight, and they would be government employees. He's not doing that, but these others are. And so they may have their own billionaire ideas about priorities. But you have to keep your eye on what they're doing, not just on the branding, the Musk, Doge, Tesla government plans and the talk of saving you money, when the person doing that talk and the other billionaires seem to be pretty good at one thing: amassing their own wealth through any which way they have to, including the countries, often many countries that they deal with, government contracts, tax codes, and the rest. And if that's what they're known for, you have to ask, do you believe them and the incoming Trump administration that campaigns so much on working class values, that they are going to switch from what they've been doing their whole lives, amassing wealth for themselves, and suddenly put all of that effort to amassing what? Wealth for someone else? Wealth for you? And wealth for you at their expense?
One of the clarifying aspects of your introduction to this is the connection between the individuals who are now running the oversight of these programs and the government to fix it and to make it better, and how they're going to be impacted. So my question to Elon Musk is, so are you cutting back on your government contracts, the amount of government money that's being spent for your benefit, for your personal wealth and growth? In the programs that you're doing, you're trying to get to Mars. So do we, need to cut back on that? Because I'm sure there's a lot of waste in that program that you're collecting $1 billion check from, right? So that's the reality here for us. But the reality for him is, let's look at Medicaid and SNAP programs. Let's look at education and child care programs. Not the things that affect me, because I don't have any child I need to care for, and I damn sure are not on SNAP, right? That's not my issue. My issue is I collect $1 billion a month from what I'm doing. This family is collecting $100 a month for what they're doing. And so that's the balancing act that the Trump administration is going to have to confront. And the Republicans in the House and the Senate, Ari, who now manage all of that and in control of that, that's the governing part, right? We're going to have to realize that a lot of the programs they want to cut affect the people who live in the very red states and districts that they represent. Don't believe me. After the election, all these Republicans love putting up that big red map, how red the country was, right? Well, let's start cutting and see how much blood you take from those red districts in those red states.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, here's a New York Times report, and there have been many about this, basically saying Republicans are actually going to probably oppose some of these so-called, they called them, the Times called it Biden's triumphs. You can call it domestic spending. Trump supporters expressed concern about how the potential rollbacks of some of these laws, including green and other programs that basically did what you just mentioned, put funding into red districts, how that could affect job losses, hurt companies. Again, at the baseline level of the workers that we heard so much about in the election, not the billionaires who are going to get this tax windfall while they claim to oversee the government.
Keep in mind, guys like Elon Musk and even Vivek Ramaswamy, and certainly a lot of the folks who are coming into this administration have all been takers. They've never managed a government budget. They've never had to run a city. They've never had to manage a state and balance trash collection against educational programs and healthcare programs. You know, elected officials are elected to sit there and make those hard choices and explain to people why. So when Elon Musk said, yes, there will be pain associated, pain for who? Not you, bro. You're not feeling this. You know, you've never felt it. You have never felt what it's like to have a food stamp program cut and all of a sudden you can't shop where you wanted to shop or buy the food you need, or have your health care taken from you or reduced, and then wonder whether or not you'll be able to continue the level of medication that you have for your mom or yourself. You've never had those concerns. So why are you the one making those choices? You're unelected. It's not even a real department. It's all made up. This is voodoo BS. And at the end of the day, there are a lot of people with Republican backing and support who are going to be hurt by this.
Once again, in a fluid situation, covering what is day 4 of the former Fox News weekend morning show anchor's attempt to win over skeptical Senate Republicans. At least 6 of them, according to NBC News, is reporting, are, quote, not comfortable supporting his bid to lead the Pentagon, putting Hegseth's candidacy, quote, in peril. Senator Joni Ernst, who is viewed as central to all of this, today confirmed that she is, as of today, not a yes on his confirmation.
Will you support his nomination?
Well, I did have a very long, lengthy discussion with Pete yesterday, and I do appreciate his service to the nation. I also am a combat veteran. So we talked about a number of those issues, and we will continue with the vetting process. I think that that is incredibly important. So again, all I'm saying is we had a very frank and productive discussion, and I know that we will continue to have conversation in the upcoming months.
Okay, it doesn't sound on your answer that you've gotten to a yes. If I'm wrong about that, correct me. And if that is the case, it sounds to me as if the hearing will be critical for his nomination. Am I right about that?
I think you are right.
In fact, the nomination is so much in peril that we are monitoring this closely. We will be for the next 2 hours for any sign that Hegseth's status as Trump's first choice to run the Pentagon could change. Or, as has been widely reported, that Donald Trump has changed his mind and tapped one of his alternates, someone like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who, according to 4 sources, Trump is already, quote, in advanced talks with about taking the job. So far, Hegseth's attempt to win over key Senate Republicans is not going very well. Case in point, as we showed you, Joni Ernst, who is the first female combat veteran elected to the Senate and a vocal advocate for survivors of military sexual trauma. Here's more of what she had to say after meeting with Hegseth yesterday.
It was a very frank, thorough discussion. Senator, will you support Mr. Hegseth's nomination? It was a frank and thorough conversation.
Did he ask for your vote specifically?
Thank you.
When you met with Matt Gaetz, you said he brought up some of the allegations against him. Did Pete Hegseth bring up any of these things?
It was a very thorough conversation.
And also frank.
Any of your concerns? Did you meet any of your concerns?
Guys, need a pathway.
Frank and thorough conversation. And as Politico reports, a no from Senator Joni Ernst may be enough to end Hegseth's bid altogether. So we'll keep watching her. This is that reporting, though. Quote, when it comes to Pete Hegseth's bid to be the next Pentagon chief, each senator gets a vote. But but one vote matters more than the others. Hegseth can afford to lose only 3 Republican votes in the Senate before his nomination would fall apart, assuming Democrats remain unanimously opposed. It is unclear how many others would take her cue, but her status as the Senate's first female combat veteran and track record on the issue of military sexual assault gives her added influence and credibility. But you do have to hand it to Hegseth. He says he's still going for it, full steam ahead.
Do you feel like you're making progress in these meetings?
Great meetings.
Yeah.
Appreciate the process. Senators give great advice, and this is how the process works. It's not going to be tried out here. It's going to be discussed inside the offices, how we rebuild our military, put the warfighters first. That's what President Trump has asked me to do, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Are there any circumstances where you would withdraw from this process?
I'm here with the support of President Donald Trump. As long as he supports me, which he told me this morning, I'll be here.
And we know Donald Trump supports people like Pete Hegseth in these situations 100% of the time, right up until he does not at all. Shortly before we came on the air, Pete Hegseth emerged from his meetings with Senate Republicans on Capitol Hill. Here's more of what he had to say.
I'm a different man than I was years ago, and that's a redemption story that I think a lot of Americans appreciate. I will answer all of these senators' questions, but this will not be a process tried in the media. I don't answer to anyone in this group, none of you, not to that camera at all. I answer to President Trump, who received 76 million votes on behalf and a mandate for change.
Pete Hegseth, in his own words, on a redemption tour. It's where we start today with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. With me at the table, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard joins us, and Democratic strategist and professor at Columbia University, MSNBC political analyst Basil Smikle's here. Also joining us, former Republican Congressman, MSNBC political analyst David Jolly's here. Vaughn Hilliard. There are a lot of things about Pete Hegseth that Trump likes, the TV persona being one of them. I'm guessing the toxic male aura, another one of them. But there are as many things now that he doesn't like. The accounts as recently as 1 month ago from our colleagues from our NBC News colleagues reporting from 10 sources, current and former employees of Fox News, about him being drunk and smelling of alcohol until moments before he went on the air.
That's something that Donald Trump doesn't like. And I think that this is a conversation that should be around Donald Trump's judgment. Let's be very clear. This isn't about Pete Hegseth to a great degree. This is about Donald Trump making decisions from his gut, in haste, without consultation, without FBI background checks. Donald Trump feels like he won this election, and the American people told him that he should move forward and proceed with the band of brothers who he believes he can best run this administration through. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did in those first 2 weeks, filling out this cabinet with people like Pete Hegseth, though, with very little outside counsel. And frankly, it was in that 48 hours leading up to the decision to nominate Pete Hegseth that I was having conversations with sources, colleagues of ours here at NBC News were as well. And Pete Hegseth's name was nowhere to be seen. And it was a surprise announcement when he turned to him because nobody had anticipated that. And now Donald Trump is the one bearing the consequences of his judgment and his haste in which he made that decision.
What's interesting is that Donald Trump described to the degree he had a guiding philosophy in 2016 for picking a cabinet as choosing, quote, all the best people. That's not anything he's said about any of these people. And he does seem to be for this, as in your words, band of brothers, until he's not. I mean, we haven't heard Matt Gaetz. I mean, his only job today is as a cameo offering. He's for people until he isn't. And I wonder what you sense, and as sort of someone who knows Trump and knows what sort of the push and pull is, if you have any sense of what trajectory this nomination's on.
This is also, to kind of answer your question, Nicole, is oftentimes I've been having conversations around who comes next and who comes in year 3 and year 4 of the Trump administration. Because as you said, this is not 2017. Donald Trump, the pool of people that he has to choose from is very, very, very small because he is looking for people that are loyal, that he has full faith and confidence will do whatever he says that he wants them to do. In the case of Pete Hegseth, what he wants to see the military do. And then you also are looking for people that he respects. That's also a small pool of people. And people that is sort of you could justify to a certain extent being qualified. He's not looking for experts by and large. Look, I mean, nothing against Matt Whitaker, but he has no experience to be the ambassador to NATO. And Brooke Rollins to be the Secretary of Agriculture, Linda McMahon to be the Secretary of Education. So that's even low on the list. So for him, people that are loyal and who he respects, it's actually a very small pool of people.
Right.
And frankly, when you look at the backup alternatives to Pete Hegseth, those are people, Ron DeSantis, Joni Ernst, Bill Hagerty. Those are folks that don't necessarily exactly fit that mold. So that's my question. If he doesn't get Pete Hegseth, then who does he turn to? And then who does he turn to in year 3 and year 4? Because we've seen a history of secretaries through his first administration leave within a year or two.
Let's bring in CNBC's senior Washington correspondent, Eamon Javers, and David Fahrenthold, investigative reporter for the New York Times. Okay, Eamon, you interviewed Vivek Ramaswamy just yesterday for CNBC at the CFO Summit. I want to play a little bit of what he told you.
A lot of the political philosophical musing about whether or not we should be cutting entitlements or not, or whether or not the president can impound funds, it's a deflection from the fact that there's a lot lower hanging fruit in terms of waste, fraud, abuse, error, program integrity failures that you got to go after first before we ever need to get to those harder political questions.
I'm so curious, what was your sense? Because I think you talked to him for, like half an hour or something. Big picture of what the real goals of DOGE are.
You know, it's a total transformation and reinvention of the federal government in a much smaller size, delivering much fewer services to much fewer people. I mean, that's sort of what he has in mind. He's talking about a total transformation of the way Washington, D.C. does business, and he wants to do it with a lot less employees in the federal government. You know, the question is whether he can achieve any of that. These goals are insanely ambitious by inside the Beltway standards, right? And they're going to run into opposition from members of Congress up on Capitol Hill. As you say, you know, this panel that he's on is sort of an invented outside of government panel. All they can do is make recommendations. And the power of the purse under the Constitution is with Congress. And there are Republican members of the appropriations committees who are people who are, you know, entitled by the Constitution to actually set federal spending priorities, who will not like to have Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy telling them what to do, right? So they're going to run into some institutional problems right off the bat. And I think that's what today on Capitol Hill is designed to sort of head off to the extent that they can.
Yeah, it is really interesting, David. Rosa DeLauro, I think, spoke for a lot of folks, especially on the Democratic side. She said that the DOGE folks have zero authority. It's a gang of two. It's Congress that makes these determinations. But we also know if they have the ear of Donald Trump, their influence could be significant. So my question is, having two billionaires with influence over policy proposals that it could impact their own bottom lines, their company's bottom lines, obviously brings potential conflict of interest questions. And I know you've spent a lot of time looking into the way the incoming Trump team is treating disclosure and ethics requirements. But I mean, if Rusk and Ramaswamy aren't even government employees, are there any ethical guardrails?
It doesn't seem like there are. And in fact, you know, one of the few sort of details we've gotten about what these folks want to do is from Musk. And when he talks about the kind of regulations he wants to cut, he talks about regulations that directly affect his own businesses, regulations that slow down his launches from SpaceX down in South Texas, regulations that stop the Boring Company from building a tunnel it wants to build, regulations that stop what Tesla's trying to do with self-driving cars. He feels like when he talks about what's the government doing wrong, it's slowing him down. So yes, he doesn't seem like he's recusing himself from those situations. In fact, they seem like the center of what he's trying to do.
So, Eamon, on Morning Joe this morning, our friend, former Treasury official Steve Ratner, added up some of Musk and Ramaswamy's proposed cuts, things they've talked about, including elimination of entire programs, VA, healthcare, the NIH, FBI, SEC. But even cuts that drastic in many people's minds would only amount to $221 billion. Do they really think, or at least talking to Ramaswamy, does he really think that $2 trillion worth of cuts is realistic?
You know, he didn't commit to a lot when I talked to him yesterday. He didn't commit to the $2 trillion figure. I asked him for, one example of one large thing north of $10 billion that he'd like to cut. He wouldn't commit to any example there. I asked him, what guidance has Donald Trump given him about what Trump wants to cut from the federal budget? He wouldn't put a specific on that either. And I asked him about these conflicts of interest with Elon Musk in terms of Elon Musk either getting federal contracts and deciding which contracts are then wasteful or not. Maybe his competitors are wasteful and his are not. He didn't want to really address that directly, and he didn't want to address the question of whether Elon Musk has a conflict of interest in terms of China. Elon does an enormous amount of business in China. He's very critical of, freedom of speech issues here in the United States, but not so much in China. Hasn't said a whole lot about freedom of speech in China, right? And so the question is, if he's going to be serving in an administration that is as anti-China as the Trump administration says it wants to be, are there conflicts of interest there? Ramaswamy kind of talked around that one as well. So they're clearly not at a point now where they're willing to put any detail on this at all. And maybe that's behind closed doors what they're going to start to do up on Capitol Hill today. It's a very, very tall order.
Yeah, and we're waiting to hear from them. Obviously, the podium is there. We're waiting for them to show up. But, David, Musk and Ramaswamy have also been talking about a topic that could have broad popular support, getting rid of daylight savings time. Musk actually wrote, "Looks like the people want to abolish the annoying time changes." Ramaswamy responded, "It's inefficient and easy to change." I mean, I don't even know that's part of their purview. Nevertheless, is it your sense that while the budget may be the central focus of DOJ, the sky's the limit on potential influence?
Well, we're in a great period for them because they don't have any power yet. Trump's not in office. There's nobody out there checking their power or telling them no. So this is the time to sort of spitball and the sky's the limit. Everything seems so easy. So, but I do think it's a little worrisome for them now that instead of focusing on, okay, we're going to cut waste out of Medicare through this step and this step and this step, we're going to go after the Pentagon and make sure its budget is audited this way. Instead of diving into the details that would actually lead them to their goal, they're sort of going off on other tangents that, while maybe popular, don't really have anything to do with government efficiency. What I want to see from them is, are they serious? Are they serious enough to really dive into the weeds of these big federal bureaucracies and find the waste, fraud, and abuse? Or do they just want to tweet about it? And so far, it seems like they just want to tweet about it.
And joining me now is Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut, who's the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, to be frank, I noticed Olivia's posting because it was reposted by Senator Murphy, from Connecticut. So there is a notice among those who will have to vote on his confirmation that Kash Patel is going after people who criticize him. What's your reaction?
Well, not at all surprised, right? So, I worked with Kash Patel when he was a member of the Republican staff working for Devin Nunes, and he was distinguished mainly by his willingness to say and do anything to support Donald Trump, even if it was fantastical stuff. I mean, just make stuff up out of whole cloth. That's why, of course, he's been given this position. Absolutely no law enforcement experience. You played the clip, right? A commitment to deeply, deeply unconstitutional ideas. So I don't know if this particular nomination is worse than the Matt Gaetz nomination or better than the Matt Gaetz nomination, but it is something that should cause senators, if they have any self-respect, to say advice and consent means nothing if Kash Patel is confirmed to be FBI director.
Well, there's also the fact that Matt Gaetz has already been rejected, pressure to withdraw. Hegseth is under fire for a lot of, established allegations that he denies. Is there going to be the fear, the Hill, your colleagues in the Senate, is there going to be fear that, who do you go after? Do you go after Tulsi Gabbard? Do you, for, justifiable reasons, they say? Do you go after Kash Patel? How many of these bullets can you take, figuratively, for the team?
You know, there was an America once when I think a senator would say, I've got two obligations here to the Constitution. One is to make sure that the individual is qualified. And again, I would suggest that somebody who's never been in law enforcement probably shouldn't have their internship atop the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So that's question number one. And question number two, if I were a senator, would be, does this individual have the character and the commitment to really abide by the oath that we all take, which is that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not support and defend Donald Trump. So again, there was an America where that's what senators would do. But you ask exactly the right question, which is, you know, at some point Donald Trump is going to get tired of these heretical senators who are not just saying, you know, yes, sir, may I have another? So the politics are going to become increasingly difficult as Donald Trump continues to offer. By the way, I won't say they've been universal. There have been some good nominations, too. But as he continues to not offer these wacky nominations, the politics with the Senate are going to get pretty tough.
Yeah, Marco Rubio for the as Secretary of State is one, you know, example of someone who the Senate Intelligence Committee, Democrats have said he's been working as a partner and doing great work. He's experienced. He knows the field.
Sure.
That's
John
different
Ratcliffe
from
at CIA. John is experienced. He was on the Intelligence Committee. Jay Clayton, former chair of the SEC for Southern District of New York. There have been some good nominations here. There have also been some outrageously silly nominations. And, of course, that's what we see with Kash Patel.
You know, and Mike Walls, for National Security Advisor, has experience as a member of Congress. Donald Trump has already tapped, as I say, Tulsi Gabbard to be his Director of National Intelligence. You were on the House Committee. She's been accused of repeating Russian propaganda. She has said Syrian President Assad, whom she visited, Bashar al-Assad, you know, twice, is not an enemy of the U.S. without notification. We've spoken more about your concerns. Have you heard anything more from your colleagues in the Senate about her confirmation? Because she's kind of going under the radar. But what I'm hearing, even from experienced diplomats among our Five Eyes partners, the 5 countries we get, you know, so much intelligence from, is that they will not share certain sources and methods. If she is the person editing, you know, if she's the DNI editing the presidential daily brief, and they just are going to hold some stuff back, they can compartmentalize.
That's always a risk, always a risk. And, you know, when we use the word sources and methods, remember, a source is often a technology that, if discovered, would put people's lives at risk, or a source can be an individual, a human being in a place like Baghdad or Moscow or Beijing, whose life would be endangered, quite apart from the value of the information they might provide, but who could be killed if that information was mishandled. Look, with respect to Tulsi Gabbard, again, being DNI is largely a massive management task of a roughly $90 billion a year operation, which does very, very dangerous things. Tulsi Gabbard, of course, has never, I think, run anything more complicated than a House congressional office. And you were right to focus on the fact that, you know, if there's one job that senior intelligence professionals have, it is to always tell the absolute truth and to be very careful about how you do that. This is your job with respect to the president. And the fact that Tulsi Gabbard over time has promoted conspiracy theories over and over again, if I were a senator, that would be something I would want to understand and ask her about.
The national agenda for this incoming Congress. In the election, voters maintained Republican control of the House. You might remember where you were that night watching Steve at the big board, and they put Republicans in charge of the Senate. So for all the attention on the presidential race, that congressional outcome is huge. Republicans campaigned on issues like prices and immigration, and the new administration says it will tackle those issues. But there are clear developments I can tell you about right now, our top story tonight, that show what congressional Republicans are doing with their newfound power. So this election, as you have heard, may have turned on the price of eggs. That's the saying anyway. I bet you've heard it. But Republican leaders are rushing to use their power to do things that seem pretty unrelated or even contradictory, like cut support for seniors and health care for seniors, and cut health care for Americans actually of all ages. Here's a Republican congressman discussing the related programs of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
We're going to have some hard decisions. We got to bring the Democrats in and talk about Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. There's hundreds of billions of dollars to be saved, and we know how to do it. We just have to have the stomach to actually take those challenges on.
There you heard. Cutting hundreds of billions from those programs would cost people a lot more than even the admitted severity and hardship of those high prices that we've heard about over the last few years. Seniors get over $1,500, $2,000 plus sometimes in Social Security monthly, and they've all paid into that for decades. So slashing billions will hit them. Republicans won the House by just about 5 seats or so. Trump won by 1.5 points, a narrow margin that would not seem to be a wide mandate for, say, just completely gutting the safety net. And while we're talking mandates, the mandate for supporting these programs is higher than the support for Trump last month or for other politicians like Kamala Harris. Indeed, responding to this economy election by cutting programs that help people through a tough economy would seem like a contradiction. And even Republicans, before they get going, before they even take charge next month, are already concerned about the political downside of these kind of cuts, given that 70 million Americans are under these programs. So that's part of the Republican plan. And what would the Republicans do if they actually did cut these billions out of the budget? Well, they're very clear on that. They would move them from these working class seniors to the ultra wealthy, with more tax cuts modeled on Trump's first-term tax cuts, which have sometimes so distorted the tax code that working-class Americans pay higher rates than the billionaires, or the billionaires pay less than the working class. However you say it, that's pretty wild. Now, there are billionaires who back both parties. That's just a public fact. So the idea here is not that any billionaire involvement in politics is automatically bad. But it's worth noting that Democrats, while they've struggled with criticism that they're not doing enough for labor or the working class, we are living through a real-world test of this. Over the past 4 years, the Biden-Harris administration, these billionaires who backed Democrats didn't get a new big tax break. And the safety net programs I just mentioned were not slashed these past 4 years. So the economic contrast is clear, even if taxes and the annual rates people are paying are not always as top of mind as the price of eggs. Now, Trump may mislead about his margin. House Republicans see no upside, however, though, in overselling or raising expectations about their narrow margin because they have a narrow control over the House, which is familiar for them. They started this current Congress with the infighting and a very narrow vote margin, which led to the standoffs like you see here. Matt Gaetz and Kevin McCarthy fighting over those many, many rounds of voting. Those clashes and mutinies echo to this day because while some of the players have changed, the new speaker, which Matt Gaetz helped install, is working within a 2-seat margin right now, as thin as 217 to 215 because Trump has plucked 3 House members for his administration. And will eventually swing back to 5. It's still one of the narrowest House margins in the past century. That's not narrow as a criticism. It's not narrow as trying to spin or adjust how people did in the election. It's just a fact that if you have a narrow election and you don't win by a lot, then you don't have a lot of seats in your margin, which is a contrast to, say, other years where people are up by 20, 30 seats, and any number, a couple of defections won't make a big difference. So if you remember one thing from what's happening right now, remember this, because it's going to guide our politics for at least the next 2 years. While Trump keeps overselling his 1.5-point margin for the reason that he generally likes to inflate or exaggerate, and he wants to say he's got a big round of support, even though it's actually 1.5 points, the Republican coming out of the same election with a very similar narrow finish is not doing that, is not overselling it. The House Republican Speaker wants everyone to know up front, before they even take over next month, they have no votes to spare.
We have nothing to spare. But all of our members know that. We talked about that today, as we do constantly, that this is a team effort, that we've got to all row in the same direction.
Anyone rowing in a different direction, 2 or 3 people defecting, and they won't be able to squeeze in these agenda items, which, as I've just shown you, some of which might depart quite a ways from what we heard the voters in their vote, in their exit polls, in all our interviews, what the voters had on their minds, which is the cost of living, the prices, also immigration. We heard a lot about that, but not necessarily gutting Social Security and health care. We quoted a range of outlets, including the Washington Post, and now we turn to Washington Post senior news anchor Libby Casey. Welcome back.
Thanks so much, Harry.
What do you think first about the sort of clear political gap between what Trump is selling, hey, look how big you won, and what we just heard there from Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, that margin that you laid out is so thin. And you have to remember the last Congress that Speaker Johnson eventually inherited and led was, by any objective metric, very dysfunctional. And it only took a couple of members to topple Speaker McCarthy and create real chaos. Johnson had to rely on Democrats to help them out at times. And now we are facing a very different situation. The Senate will have a little more breathing room. But this is the challenge. When you win the House, the Senate, and the presidency, you can have really lofty goals and ambitions, but it is very hard to get everybody rowing in the same direction. There are big competing interests that are already starting to show.
Yeah. Let me play for you what Mike Johnson was saying here about his meeting with some of the big Trump players right now.
We want to take a blowtorch to the regulatory state. And I think what Elon and Vivek have in mind can help us in that regard. And so I invited them both to come to the Hill because we want to get everybody together that has that same mindset. We'll be inviting all the Senate and House Republicans together to a big sort of brainstorming session because we need to do that early in the process so we can formulate what the actual plans are.
What do you see as what Johnson is trying to navigate, what expectations he's managing, which I mentioned, and then the part of his caucus that wants tax cuts and Social Security cuts and all of that, again, with a backdrop where people have been promised something else out in the country?
Yeah, so Donald Trump has said he won't cut Social Security. We've heard that before from him. We're talking about Medicare and Medicaid. It's going to be hard to go to voters and say you're going to have to hit increased checks. You're going to have to do a work for increased SNAP benefits or, prove yourself when they're offering tax cuts for the wealthy. Some of this actually comes out of the playbook, Ari. You won't be surprised of Project 2025. They laid out in there trying to increase the work benefits, the work requirements for things like SNAP, food stamp benefits. Johnson and Thune, who will lead the Senate Republicans, and then Trump and his cabinet are going to have to figure out what they're going to prioritize. Now, Thune is saying he wants to hit energy, he wants to hit the border, and he wants to hit defense right away within like 30 days. I think 100 days is probably a more realistic timeline, but he's already getting pushback from members of his own caucus who say, well, wait, we want to hit taxes. We want to do something else. And when you look at the government, and we can talk about DOGE and the efforts to try to make more government efficiency, the big spenders are things that are very hard to touch. We're talking about those benefits that Americans receive. We're talking about the Pentagon. Some of the proposals I'm hearing are, it's a lot of money for me and you, like $1 million here and $1 million there, but it's small in terms of the government.